I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today. John Stonestreet serves as president of the Colson Center. He's a sought-after author and speaker on areas of faith and culture, theology, worldview, education, and apologetics. John is the daily voice of Breakpoint, the nationally syndicated commentary on the culture founded by the late Chuck Colson. He is also the voice of The Point, a daily one-minute feature on worldview, apologetics, and cultural issues. He has co-authored 5 books, including A Practical Guide to Culture and Restoring All Things. John holds degrees from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and Bryan College. He and his wife, Sarah, have 4 children and live in Colorado Springs, Colorado. For myself, do more in life. You will have gotten, you're going to be handed an index card from Christy Wilson during the session. If you have a question and you want to write it down for John's QA session, which comes after this, just raise your hand during his speech. Those don't mean questions. Those means people who are going to write questions down. And Christy will come around and give you one of these so that we have these in prep for the QA. So that will happen right after this. And without further ado or shenanigans, I welcome John Stonestreet.
Thank you. Wow, that was an introduction. I appreciate that. And of all the introductions I've ever had, that one is the most recent. And although I'm actually a little offended because I hear yesterday there was a clip of Top Gun, and I get that. So really, not sure what to even think about that.
It was a one-day Top Gun only, so
one day. I just was here for the wrong day. Well, listen, I'm really, I know it's kind of the obligatory thing for a speaker to begin by saying, I'm honored to be here. Usually I say it, but I don't really mean it. Now, I do mean it. I really love the mission of institutions like Veritas. We're classical Christian schooling parents ourselves. That's the choices that we've made for our kids. We have 4 kids, Sarah and I do. Abigail is 17, Anna is 15, Allie is 13, and Hunter is 5. So, yeah, there was an 8-year gap. If you do the math, Abigail, Anna, Allie, and Hunter, it's A-A-A-H, which spells which is what Hunter did to us when he showed up out of the blue. But, you know, we're parents. One of the books that was mentioned earlier, I wrote with a friend of mine named Brett Kunkel, called A Practical Guide to Culture. And if you ask Brett why he wrote that book, he'll say he has 5 reasons. If you ask me, I'll say I have 4 reasons. His 5 reasons are his 5 kids. My 4 reasons are our 4 kids. And the reason, and of course, it's because things are changing fast. I love what a classical Christian education does, and it does things that I think are distinct to this form and this approach. At the same time, as we're grounding kids in truth, they're entering into a world that is swirling, and swirling in a hurry. Anybody else here maybe just a little bit dizzy by how quickly things go from being unquestionable or unthinkable to unquestionable, and just kind of in a blink of an eye? This is the world we live in. There's a book written years ago that I have always thought, I have a theological degree. One of the books that I have found to be extremely helpful in understanding sin. There's a book that is a wonderful theology of sin. I know that kind of sounds like a weird description right off the bat. And some of you are like, I don't need any help understanding sin. I'm an expert, right? But there's a book called Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, A Breviary of Sin, and it describes kind of what sin is on a personal level, on a structural level, how that affects various human relationships and all the ways in the wake that it has. It's a really, really helpful book. The author's a guy named Neil Plantinga, who's at Calvin Seminary, and I've heard him speak on this several times, and in the book too, he says something really interesting. And I want to use this kind of as a kicking off point for our conversation today about what's happening in the culture around us and how to make sense of it. Neil says that whenever Christians talk about sin, they need to talk about sin as if they're Christians. And that's important because we don't talk a lot about sin, right? We don't talk a lot about sin in our culture. I think it was David Brooks in his recent book on character, The Road to Character. He said, in our day and age, we only talk about sin and sinfulness when we're talking about desserts, We don't really talk about sin as an act of human behavior. But Plantinga says in his book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, he said, whenever we talk about sin, we need to talk about sin as if it is a real foe, because it is. But we should never talk about sin as Christians as if it's not a defeated foe, because it is. When we talk about culture and we think about what's happening in the world around us, and we think about how quickly things have changed and are changing and seem to be changing day by day, and I'm hopefully going to give us some handles to hold on to and understanding that as parents and as educators. But when we think about what's happening in culture, it's important that we think about culture and we think about the challenges of culture as if they are actually happening, because they are actually happening. We should think about them as if they're not... We don't remove at all the gravity from the cultural changes that are happening in this moment, because the things that we're fiddling with culturally are pretty big. It's one thing, just think about it collectively. It's one thing for a nation to agree on what it wants to strive for, but disagree on how to get there, even disagree with great passion. It's a completely different thing to be in a time and a place like ours where we don't even agree on what we're aiming at. Does that make sense? So when we talk about the challenges of the cultural moment, we should talk about the culture as if it is real, and the challenges of this moment as if they are real, because they are, and they're real for the hearts and minds of our children. But we should never talk about the challenges of the cultural moment as if they're the whole story, because they're not. The whole story is the story that emerges from the pages of Scripture. The story of the creation of the heavens and earth to the new creation, or to the new heavens and the new earth. Does that make sense? That's the story. And what's so helpful about the story, in fact, if we were going to do this right, and I'm going to switch the order, but if we were really going to do this right, what we would do is start with the story. Because what that story does, what that overarching framework of reality does, it gives us kind of that map that we need. And it's kind of like going to a mall. You remember those? You remember the days of shopping malls when they used to exist? I used to hate going to those things. I would only go, because I was in a strange town looking for a coffee shop, or because it was like December 24th or something like that. So, but if you wanted to find a store, you went to that map and you needed to find that store. But on the map, you also needed to find what? That little yellow arrow that says you are here. And that's what's so great about the chaos of this moment, is that the story gives us this big framework, all right? So I don't want to give away too many punchlines about the story. We're going to come back to that after the break and after our Q&A time. But I do want to say this, because I think it's just absolutely critical. When we talk about how crazy it is out there, we should always talk about how crazy it is out there in the context of what is ultimately true. And that is that Jesus Christ is on the throne of the universe because he has risen from the dead and defeated sin and death. Right? This is not just a platitude of Christian conviction. A lot of times when we say these things like, Christ is risen. You remember we say that every Easter Sunday morning. Unless you're Orthodox. If you're Eastern Orthodox, you'd say that every week at worship. Now, I'm not, for various theological reasons, but I think they got that one right. We look at each other on Easter Sunday and we say, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Usually what we mean is I believe Jesus is risen from the dead. I hope you believe Jesus is risen from the dead, but that's never been the proclamation. The proclamation is Jesus Christ is risen from the dead, whether you believe it or not. Like, this is a truth of the universe. And Peter will write his first letter, 1 Peter, he'll write that first letter and say, because that is true, then hope for the Christian is secure. That's where hope comes from, is that Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. So whenever we talk about the change around us, we need to remember that there is a true story of reality. There is someone who is superintending that story, and he is watching over us. And there's another aspect of this, which I'll come back to a little bit later, but this is a very important punchline. Neither you nor your kids are in this cultural moment by accident. One of the things that emerges in Scripture is God reveals himself to be a God of time and place. He's precise. And not only that, when Paul's speaking to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers in Athens, one of the things he says is that the God who made everything determines the exact times that people live and the boundaries of their dwelling place. Do you believe anything as a Christian that you don't particularly like? That's one of those things for me. Like, I believe that God wanted Abigail, Anna, Allie, and even little Hunter, who thinks he's Spider-Man, to be in this cultural moment right now. And that's something I don't particularly like. If I had my choice, I would have picked a different cultural moment. You say, which one? I don't know. The good old days. I don't know when they were, but I've read about them. They're great. Another way to think about this is the time and place we find ourselves in history is not an accidental context in which we are to follow Christ. It is our calling. We are called not just to certain gifts, not just to certain jobs, not just to certain relationships. We are called to different moments in history as part of this big redemptive story. So whenever we think and talk about how dramatically things have changed, we need to think about that. Now, since we are at a place that prizes great literature, let's jump in and talk about culture a little bit. And I want to do it through the lens of something that I've been thinking a lot about over the last several months. There was a guy who prophesied an awful lot about what the 20th century was going to do, or what was going to happen in the 20th century. This guy was a very accurate prophet, actually. He gets a bad rap, maybe because he said God is dead and he died of syphilis in an insane asylum. But other than that, anybody know who I'm talking about? Friedrich Nietzsche. Remember? Nietzsche, one of the great atheist philosophers, lived at the end of the 19th century. He famously said, God is dead. Now, what he did not mean is that there was a God who then died. It wasn't a statement of ontology. Big word. You got that? Write that down. O-N. Oh, she's not even paying attention. O-N-T-O-L. Ontology mean? That's the question. All right. When Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, what he was saying is that this world, this Western world that had been largely built with God as the central reference point, that reference point had now been dismissed through the Enlightenment, skepticism, through the growth of scientific knowledge, the displacement of the church, the separation of church and state in all kinds of different ways. And who he was really speaking to was not really the religious people, although he kind of was. Who he really was speaking to, particularly in one of his works, and I would really encourage you to go read this. It's accessible on the internet. It's not super long. It's something called The Parable of the Madman. And in The Parable of the Madman, Nietzsche is actually talking to the other skeptics, other people who did not believe in God. And he does this through a parable. The parable is, there was a madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours. Now, why would you light a lantern in the bright morning hours? Well, because you're mad, or because you think everyone else is still in the dark. And he runs into the marketplace, this madman, and he cries out, I seek God, I seek God. In the marketplace, there are a bunch of cynics, a bunch of skeptics, so they mock him. You're looking for God? No one believes in God anymore, and so they make fun of him. They ask those kind of Elijah to the prophets of Baal sorts of questions, like, well, maybe he's gone on a trip, or maybe he's sleeping, or maybe he is, gone. And so they basically make fun of him. And so then the madman stares back at them, and he goes, where is God? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. And then the madman goes on this epic rant, and it really is epic. Because the point that Nietzsche is trying to make through the madman is not so much about the existence of God or non-existence of God. It's about the consequences once God is removed from the cultural picture. Once something has provided an anchor, a reference point, a tethering place for so many other aspects of life as individuals, as families, and as communities, once that's gone, it's a big deal. And Nietzsche believed that the rest of the religious skeptics of of his day did not understand what they had really done. In the words of the madman, he goes, how did we do this? How could we pull this off? We wiped away the entire horizon with a sponge. How did we do this? And he actually says something remarkable. He says, doesn't that mean we have to become gods simply to appear worthy of killing God? It's a remarkable, epic thing. And here's why he is challenging them, is because most of the skeptics, the religious skeptics at the end of the 19th century, were utopianists. Their view was, if we get God out of the picture, suddenly there's no ceiling on human ability, human reason, human experimentation, and now we can actually move the world forward. And of course, you can understand why they were so kind of drugged up high on human achievement. We're talking about the end of the 1800s, right? How much scientific knowledge and achievement and ability happened during, with this kind of growth of science and the Enlightenment and all the things that kind of came out of that. So there was essentially the Western world was in a high about human ability, and you can understand it. It was kind of remarkable. But you had a group of people who believed that they were going to fix the world. You can read the utopianist out of both philosophers, social scientists, political leaders. These were folks who believed that without God and religion holding us back, we could move into a time of unfettered progress and prosperity. Primarily, it was either through economic determinism or it was through eugenics. Economic determinism, we treat people like economic parts of the whole and we can just grow the engine. Of course, that took various forms, or through eugenics. In other words, we now are all good Darwinists. We know that humans are nothing but animals. We've bred better animals. Now we can breed better humans. Those were the two primary ways that we were going to fix the world, according to the thought leaders at the end of the 1800s. Nietzsche believed differently. And another place, Nietzsche predicted that the 20th century wouldn't be a time of unfettered prosperity and progress, but the 20th century would instead be a time of bloodshed. He predicted that the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in human history. Who got it right, Nietzsche or the utopianist? Nietzsche predicted that if there's not a God to tell us what's right and wrong and what's up and down, then people were going to have to do that. In particular, the strong man. He predicted the rise of the Ubermensch, or the Superman, or the strong man, somebody that basically takes godlike status in a society or amongst a cultural group to lead them forward. Can you think of anybody in the 20th century that had a Superman complex? Yeah. In other words, Nietzsche got it exactly right, and he did it in the mouth of this madman in this parable. And it's a remarkable thing that he says. One of the analogies he uses, he says, how were we able to unchain the earth from its sun? In other words, one of the great discoveries, of course, of the scientific revolution is that the sun did not revolve around the earth, and the earth was not the center of the universe, but the earth revolved around the what? The sun. And that's, of course, led to all kinds of other discoveries and so on. What would happen if the sun disappeared one day? Yeah, bad day. Yeah, that's fair enough. Good summary. Yeah. Do you understand what the point Nietzsche's trying to make to all these utopianists? We just unchained the earth from its sun. This is a big deal. He says, how do we know what up and down is anymore? How do we know what forward and backward is anymore? If we don't have a sun anymore, isn't it becoming colder? Isn't it becoming darker? Isn't it becoming more dreary? And then there's this remarkable line. This is the one that keeps coming back to me. And the reason it keeps coming back to me is that prior to COVID, there were some of us that started to get worried about some of the things we were seeing culturally that were being put into a grouping called deaths from despair, the rise of opioid addiction, suicidal ideations, and so on. And then also another group of activities that we were seeing on the rise that maybe you could call acts of desperation, where people were just acting out. And then people that were, we were seeing this rise, by the way. I don't know if you knew this, but in 2019, that was the third straight year where the mortality rate, let's put it this way, the average life expectancy of the American male went down for 3 straight years. Do you know when the last time that took place was? The early the early 1910s. I think it was mid-1910s. I think it was like 15, 16, 17. You know what was happening at that point? World War I and the Spanish flu. In other words, before COVID, 2017, 18, and 19, we had 3 straight years of a decline in the life expectancy of the American male. The last time it had happened was during a world war and a pandemic. I'm absolutely convinced that COVID did not cause as many problems in American culture as it revealed. We know that many people who died from COVID had pre-existing conditions. These things complicated the disease. Not everyone, but that's one of the punchlines that's emerged. Just like there were pre-existing health conditions that individuals have, we have to know there were pre-existing social conditions that sending everyone home in lockdown and isolation did not help. Now, I'm not talking about whether the policies were good or bad. I'm just saying here's where we are. And walking out of seeing those numbers and then sending everyone home and wondering, what is this going to do to the teenage suicide rate? What is this going to do to the crisis of people just acting out in strange ways? Look, before they removed the mask mandate on planes, I was worried about every flight that people were crazy. And I was one of them. Like everybody was on the verge of just making bad decisions, including me. It was just crazy. Nietzsche goes, in the words of the madman, he goes, "Are we not straying as through an infinite nothingness?" There's different ways to talk about what's happening in our cultural world. In the book, Practical Guide to Culture, we use the analogy of water. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. Why wouldn't you ask the fish? I asked a group of high schoolers that several years ago. They're like, I don't know, because fish can't talk. I was like, no. It's because fish don't even know that they are. Culture is to humans what water is to fish. It's just the air we breathe. Culture is powerful in our lives, not because it shakes us around, but because it just makes things seem normal. Does that make any sense? The normalizing power of culture is what makes it so incredibly effective and incredibly powerful. So just like water, there's different ways we can talk about culture. One way to talk about culture is with the cultural waves. If you've ever gone to the beach and you got hit by a wave, you felt it and you know it. Anybody feel like you got hit by some waves? Cultural waves, you know? We could talk about the racial tensions. We could talk about the opioid addiction. Maybe that wave tragically has hit you in a personal way in your family or neighborhood or something. We could talk about pandemics. We could talk about the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, the I, the A, and this ever increasing acronym. All of these are cultural waves. But have you ever been to the beach and you went out or maybe here's how it always happens. You have your kids, they run out straight into the water and you're setting everything up and you see them and you look down and then you look up again and they're not there. Has that ever happened to anyone? Yeah. And then you scan down the beach 10 to 15 yards and then you find them and you're like, okay, heart attack. How did they get down there? They didn't swim there. They didn't get hit by a wave. What took them there? A current. And this is one of the things. Culture is most powerful, not typically where it's loudest. Culture is most powerful in our hearts and minds, in the hearts and minds of our children, where it makes things seem normal and what it normalizes. And these undercurrents are so important to understand. And I think Nietzsche's parable of the madman points to the undercurrents. One of the fascinating things about the parable of the madman is how it ends. So the madman goes on this crazy rant, this long epic rant. We've killed God and it's a big deal, and here's everything that this means. And basically he's just trying to tell people this is a big deal. And then he gets to the end of his rant and he looks around and the people in the marketplace are just staring back at him with a blank stare. And he goes, I've come too early. My time is not yet. Deeds, though done, require time to be seen and heard. This deed has been done. Indeed, they did the deed themselves, but they're not ready for what's about to come. When I first started teaching about worldview and different belief systems, we would compare worldviews. We would say, here's Christianity, and let's say here's scientific naturalism. Basically the belief that there is no God and the world is a place of only natural causes and processes. And one of the critiques of scientific naturalism that we would often level at it would be like, there's no source for meaning. There's no source for truth. There's no source for ultimate values, right? If everything is physical, then what is something like love? If everything is physical, what is something like justice? And if everything is just the way that it is and there was no plan or purpose, and where do you find meaning and all? And it was a rhetorical thing. And it was true because scientific naturalism can't ground these ultimate categories. But here's where we're at now. What we leveled 25 or so years ago at scientific naturalism as not being actually able to ground, what if we're existentially there in our culture? In other words, what if the noise that the madman said was coming from the death of God is now clanging in everyone's ears? What happens when you rid the world of a fixed reference point by which to navigate the world and to understand what is true and good? The loss of God is kind of like, let me put it differently. Living in the wake of the death of God that Nietzsche talked about at the end of the 1800s, which we are now 130 years later. But living in the wake now for a lot of people is an awful lot like going out into the wilderness with a compass that always points at you. A compass works not because it tells you which way to go. A compass works because it points to something that doesn't change. It points to something that's fixed. It points to the north. If you know what doesn't change, you have a fixed reference point in which to orient yourself to the rest of your surroundings. If you don't have that fixed reference point, if everywhere you turn that needle points just at you, if you're the North Pole, you're lost. I think that is what's behind the cultural undercurrents that we've identified, and there's a handful of them and I'll sum it up this way. I think you can kind of think about it this way. If you're taking notes, draw a little stick figure, okay? This is us. And God has created us, and I'll come back to this after the break, but God has created us in the context of 4 relationships. The first relationship is with God. That's the upward relationship. The second relationship is with ourselves. There's something different about humans because not only do we exist, we think about existing. That's the self relationship. Then there's the outer relationship, the relationship with others. And then there's the downward relationship, the relationship with the created order. So you've got a little stick figure. There's an arrow going up, an arrow going in, an arrow going out, and an arrow going down. Does that make sense? The thing that orients all of those relationships is that top one. It anchors the top one. And when we lose sight of God, I think what we're dealing with culturally are 4 catastrophic losses. 4 catastrophic losses that have created these undercurrents that are creating much of the context that we're trying to navigate as parents and as followers of Christ. The first one is this: a catastrophic loss of truth. A catastrophic loss of truth. Historians and sociologists love to identify different periods of history, and they give periods of history names, right? So if you've studied history at all, you've learned about the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution or, the Industrial Revolution or whatever. When people look back on our time, if 200, 300, 500 years from now they're writing history about our time, it will already be named. What is our name? What is the name of our age? Sorry? Everyone's whispering. No one wants to speak out. See, you got everyone scared. The ontological age. No. I mean, postmodern is kind of a philosophical trend that defines some of this, but it's, there's that way to look at it. The most dominant feature of our culture, I'm sorry? The internet, it's close, you're there. It's the information age. Yeah. I mean, we're named. We're the information age. Why are we the information age? Because we deal more with information than any other resource. Several years ago, a guy named Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat. And The World is Flat is about this idea that the thing that used to divide the haves from the have-nots, both nations and individuals, the wealthy from the poor, used to be natural resources, used to be, resources of some sort of kind. And he said basically the internet now has made the world flat, right? Because that's the dominant thing that people use. It's fascinating. He wrote that book back in 2000 and, I want to say 2000 and, when was that? I think he wrote that book in like 2005. And then he wrote another book in 2011, and the first chapter of the second book, which is called Thanks for Being Late, the first chapter was, what the hell happened in 2007? Anybody know what happened in 2007? The iPhone. And also the Android, basically the smartphone. In other words, Thomas Friedman said the internet made the world flat before everyone got it into their own hands. But not only that, but 2007 will go down in history as like the printing press year, because it was also the year of this remarkable fiber optics technological development, which made international communication almost instantaneous. It was also when things like Facebook became public, Twitter, Skype, all of those things became kind of things in our lives. And also Moore's Law, which is that computing speed doubles every 2 years, went from every 2 years to every 18 months. In 2007. We live in an age that has been remade. We study things like, for example, the Industrial Revolution, and we realize what a dramatic shift that has been. The Industrial Revolution changed the world. It didn't just change work, it changed family, it changed society, it changed whether people lived in the country or the city, right? And we read about it as if it happened overnight, as if one day it was the agrarian age and the next day it was the industrial age, and that's not the way that it works, right? It was over decades. In some ways, we're still dealing with the wake of the Industrial Revolution and how it reshaped much of the Western world. The point is, the shift from the agrarian age to the industrial age is now shifting from the industrial age to the information age, and we're living in the middle of that big wave, that big swell. And it's changing everything. What is it changing? First of all, it's harder to imagine that truth exists in a world that is so noisy. So we're not just talking about what is true. We're wrestling with whether or not truth could possibly exist when there's so many sources of information. In different ages of human history and different contexts, certain existential questions rise to the top. So if you go through a natural disaster, you start asking questions like, why do bad things happen? And why did God let this take place? And things like that. I think one of the great existential questions that we're seeing in our culture right now, in an age of information in which truth gets kind of drowned out, is simply this: who do I trust? Who do I trust? Do I trust my parent? Do I trust my professor? Do I trust my pastor? Do I trust my peer? Or do I just forget them all and Google it? Who do I trust? Another big thing in an age of information, and this is huge, ready? Access to information gets confused with wisdom. So what it means to know changes. Access to information gets confused with wisdom. Now, one of the things we try to do in the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, is talk about some of these big cultural undercurrents and these big changes. And then I need to do a time check here. What's my time? I'm good? 10:15, okay. He says you. That guy back there doesn't agree, I'll just tell you. What are some antidotes to living in this kind of cultural moment? Well, one of the temptations that we have, I think, especially as Christians, as people of faith, is if there's a crisis of truth, well, the good news is that we have Christianity, so we have the truth, so we need to give them truth. That's not reading the room well. It's not because we shouldn't give them truth, because of course we should give them truth. But what happens when you dump true information in a whole sea of information? What happens to the information? It just gets lost. One of the things we have to understand is whether we like it or not. And as a dad, I don't like this, but I am nothing more than one stop on the information bus of the week. And there are a lot of stops, which means what happens at our stop has to be dramatically different. So what's the antidote in an age where there's a catastrophic loss of truth? Here it is. Discernment. Discernment. This is what Paul prayed for the church at Philippi. You can read this in his prayer in chapter 1 of Philippians. He says, he prays that their love would abound more and more in truth and in all discernment. There's a great definition of discernment that comes from one of the old dictionaries. All the really good definitions of words are in the old dictionaries. Discernment is the ability to tell the difference between what is good and what is not, what is true and what is false, what is genuine and what is counterfeit. And it's the ability to prefer what is good and what is true and what is genuine over what is not, over what is false and over what is counterfeit. Isn't that good? That's the two aspects of discernment, because it brings into clarity here that we need both that kind of knowledge, the ability to tell the difference, and we also need the will. That knowing is not just an act of the mind, it's also an act of the chest, as C.S. Lewis put it. It's an act of the will, wanting to prefer what is good and what is true. And that's why, by the way, that point right there is the reason that my wife and I have jumped into the deep end when it comes to a classical approach to learning, a classical approach to education. Because we want them to know what is good and true and beautiful, and we want them to develop the muscle memory so that they can prefer it. Does that make sense? All right. Now, let me just sacrifice a holy cow. In terms of the discernment, because I think there's a piece, though, that we miss on this. A lot of times I'll hear parents throw out and trying to help their kids deal with bad messages in culture that are false or that aren't true or something like that. They'll throw out the bank teller analogy. Do you know the bank teller? You know what I'm talking about? The bank teller analogy goes like something like this. When banks want to train their tellers to recognize counterfeit bills, they only give them the real thing. And this has been an approach that many Christians have taken. In other words, we're going to stay away from all the things that aren't true, all the things that are bad, all the things that are out there, and we're just going to focus on what is true. I'm going to tell you right now that is a thoroughly flawed analogy, and it's not the right approach for three reasons. Number one, that's really not how banks train tellers. I don't know where it came from. It's just not true. It's not. Number two, we ain't training bank tellers. Even if it were, right? We're not training bank tellers. We don't want our kids just to make it through life barely not losing their, avoiding losing their faith. We want them to be in other words, if you look at what it means to follow Christ, it's a whole lot less like a bank teller and a whole lot more like a FBI. It's more like Top Gun. You know what I mean? Like, let's go, right? Let's go. We've got this, right? And there was a third reason I can't remember. So it's just a bad analogy. I'll give you a story that I think illustrates this. Understanding kind of how messages get into the hearts and minds of our kids is essential to understanding why it is that we have to, as Paul told Timothy, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. All right? To tear down these strongholds of ideas. That's got to be part of this this educational task, is tackling things that aren't true in our culture. And it goes back to what I said earlier. The things that are most influential in the hearts and minds of our kids are not the things that are the loudest, but the things that are the most normalized. C.S. Lewis put it this way: the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are argued, but the ones that are assumed. And there are a number of ideas that are assumed in our culture, and if we don't help them identify them and take them captive and tackle them head on, then they will turn out to seem just normal. We have experienced this in a hurry when it comes to all the sexual issues, haven't we? So I do a daily commentary called Breakpoint. It was started by Chuck Colson. You guys remember hearing Chuck Colson's voice from Washington, D.C.? He really did that from Florida, for the record. I just want everyone to know. I feel like I've got to come clean so we don't have a scandal. He did it from Florida. Sometimes I get in trouble for what I say. I know that's hard to believe. But the time I got in the most trouble, I got the most hate mail, it was Disney's fault. And the reason it was Disney's fault is that Disney had released Cinderella in that the live action Cinderella, and it was so good. It was beautifully done. They went back even more reliable. It was better than the cartoon. I'll stand by that one on Cinderella. It had a wonderful message. It was about courage. It was about virtue. It was about truthfulness. It was about kindness. It wasn't squishy and milquetoast. It was hard, and it was really, really impressive. And then they announced they were going to follow that up with a real live action remake of Beauty and the Beast with Emma Watson. And I had three pre-teenage girls at the time. And you know, if you have three girls in your house, that the Disney Princess campaign has been the most successful marketing movement in the history of mankind. Right? There was a time where everything in my house had one of those princesses on it, right? My curtains, my plates, my lawnmower. It was ridiculous. They were very, very excited about this. They love stories. They love true stories. And then they built up the anticipation, and a month out, do you remember what happened? There was an announcement by Disney, there's a gay moment in the movie. Do you remember this? Yeah. Now, there were three possible options then that parents like us could take. One was to not go. Many people said, we're not going to go. We're not going to support this. I think that's a very legitimate option. There was also the option of saying, we're going to go, and then hope that they don't notice. They're too young to notice. And then the third one was the approach that my wife and I chose to take. Now, I'm not saying what I think you should do as a parent. I'm still learning this together. But I will say that going and hoping your kids don't notice something that's wrong or that is absolutely unnatural or that is back to front is a way of normalizing things in their hearts and minds. Does that make sense? So we went, and we pointed it out. In fact, we went, warned them, and I still don't think they noticed. But we wanted them to notice. And the reason we wanted them to notice is because I also wanted them to notice the gay moment that would come across their paths in downtown Colorado Springs. Or while we're boarding a Delta plane, and there's the picture that's on the side of the jet bridge. I don't want it to be normal because that shapes hearts and minds. Does that make sense? It means more work for us. I get it. I get it as a parent. There's a funny story about this about my son, too, where, after having three girls in your house, you just have leftover pink stuff everywhere. And then my boy comes, and I'm like, all right, we're getting rid of all the pink stuff. And, my daughters were like, Dad, it's not a big deal. He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's doing. I'm like, you know what? I realize this is ridiculous up front, but I'm like, 20 years ago, every single message in culture was clear that there are boys and there are girls. But what the world he's being raised in is not clear about this. And so the one place it is going to be clear, doggone it, is right here. Does that make any sense? It was ridiculous. But it's kind of one of those things. Like discernment means a level of intentionality that's really important. Okay, so that's the first one, a catastrophic loss of truth. Here's the second one. This is, I think, even more shaking for many of our lives. It's a catastrophic loss of identity. If you think that the punchline of the last 30 years is the moral shifts that have taken place in America, where certain things were once considered wrong and are now considered right, and certain things that once considered right are now considered wrong, then you're missing it. Now, I'm not saying it's because there hasn't been moral shifts. Of course there's been moral shifts. That part is clear. The moral shifts that we have seen in American society are the fruit, not the root. The moral shifts we've seen in society are shifts of something deeper. You might call it, to use another big word, an anthropological shift. When you lose that fixed reference point for truth, you also lose the fixed reference point for what it means to be human. And who are we? This is why that acronym continues to grow, and they're not understood to be behaviors or sets of behaviors, they're understood to be identities. It's because we have a culture in which we are clamoring for identity. And the traditional ideas about what it means to be human in terms of our behavior, in terms of our belonging, in terms of social expectations are gone. The old institutions that used to provide a sense of identity, particularly family and church, those things are largely irrelevant in much of life. Consumerism gives us this infinite amount of choices. And unfortunately, it's not just become choices on what we can own, but it's become choices on who we can be. So in other words, identity is a category of humanness that is completely up in the air right now on a cultural level. And that's the water. That is a big, big shift. I want to point you to an article. I encourage you to read it. It explains this, I think, in some really powerful ways. My friend Rod Dreher, who writes for the American Conservative, has written an article. This dates all the way back to 2013, okay? You can Google this, but please Google it carefully, okay? Because the title of the article is Sex After Christianity. Sex After Christianity. And what he talks about is seeing that the world that we live in is not primarily determined by moral shifts, but what he calls a cosmological shift. I call it an anthropological shift, not just in terms of what we think the world is, but specifically what it means to be human. There's different ways we can go on this one. I think some of this resonates with us as we look around and we see this ever-increasing list of identities. When we look and we realize the struggle that the world is having and thinking about ethnic diversity, when we think about socioeconomic diversity, when we think about the other in any sort of way, how do we understand them? How do we understand ourselves? One of the things that has contributed to this deep loss of identity is what I'll call the critical theory mood. Most people have not read the critical legal theorist. I remember when I used to teach on postmodernism, people would say, oh, no one has really read the postmodernist. Of course not. Who can understand Foucault? Like, that makes no sense. But we didn't need Foucault because we had Britney Spears and Kurt Cobain. In other words, the same thing is true on critical theory. We haven't read the critical theorist, but what we have is a critical theory mood where we immediately put people into groupings based on things they did not choose, and we give moral superiority or we penalize on a moral level based on the groups that they belong to, and that's what it means to be human. It's another form of the identity crisis. Let me give you a passage of scripture to check out too. Psalm 135. In Psalm 135, David walks through why we ought to praise the God of Israel. And he gives 14 verses of everything that God did for Israel. And then he gets to verse 15 and he says, the idols of the nations are silver and gold made by the hands of men. They have mouths but can't speak, eyes but can't see, ears but can't hear, nor is there breath in their mouths. In other words, idols are dead. And we know that. We know it's weird. Why would someone carve an image on a block of wood and then talk to it? That makes no sense. But listen to verse 18. Those who make them will be like them. One of the ways. Now, let me back up. We know this, right? What it means to be human is to be made in the image and likeness of. If you lose that tethering with God, what does it mean to be human? To be human is to be completely up in the air. Now, what's the antidote for this? I'll give you two things, and it's got to start young. We've got to start young. The antidote is that the image of God stops being a point of Christian trivia. Here's what I mean by that. We can go from church to church to church and do what I just did with all of you. Hey, everyone, according to the Bible, humans are made in the... And then you say, what is that? And you hear a lot of crickets. It's fascinating to me, some of us that are from creedal backgrounds or liturgical backgrounds and use the catechism, go through the catechism. It's fascinating. There in the catechisms, it's typically not there. None of the ancient creeds has a statement on what it means to be human. Do you know why? Where did the ancient creeds come from? It came from the church, right? But why? What made them get together? I'm sorry? Address heresy. This is what's fascinating. When we say we live in an unprecedented time in human history, we need to be careful because we don't want to overstate it. But it's fascinating if you look back in all the creeds, which were formulated after some guy stepped up and was like, here's who Jesus is. And everyone's like, no, he's not. And they got together and said, no, let's get clear on this because, that's a heresy. Or here's what the books of the Bible are. That was in response to somebody throwing out, the whole Old Testament. There's never been a church council wrestling through what it means to be a human. It's never been up in the air until right now. And we have this rich, beautiful theological category of what it means to be human, made in the image and likeness of God. We have got to start teaching what the image of God is. Not just that we're in the image of God, but the difference the image of God makes. We've got to tether them to God in their essential identity. An aspect of that, and this is the second resource, the second antidote, and this is increasingly important right now. We have to fight this modern form of Gnosticism, which means we have to teach that the human body is not just a shell. The human body is an essential part of what it means to be made in the image of God. There is a great irony in the age we live in. Please don't take this the wrong way. I hope this is being recorded. Okay, so you go back through the 20th century, and Christian apologists were defending that Christianity was rational. Christianity could make sense in a scientific age, right? We were pointing to evidence of design, and we were pointing to making philosophical arguments. We were the ones being accused of being so out there and earthly. What was the line? You're so heavenly minded, earthly good. You remember all that? That's what we spent the entire last century doing. And today, we're the group now that are saying, hey, you have a body part and it matters. Isn't that a great ironic shift? We're the one right now that has to point to the good of the material world. When God saw all that he had made, he said, behold, it is good. And after creating humans, it is very good. Can I give you a couple resources really quick on image of God and what it means to be human? First of all, we have a whole chapter on this and a practical guide to culture on the image of God and the loss of identity. It's a critical thing. A second place you can go on this, there's not enough teaching on the image of God, by the way. My friend Dan Darling has a good book called The Dignity Revolution, and that's a good place to start. The book theologically that I like the most right now, and it's a little controversial because Roman Catholic theologians it'd be a little controversial maybe for Protestants and evangelicals. Roman Catholic theologians have wrestled with this way more than us. It just goes back to John Paul II's theology of the body and everything like that. But a guy named Christopher West has written a book called Our Bodies Tell God's Story. Think about this. Christians believe that God has revealed himself in both word and in the world. We are part of the world. It's not just that our bodies are good, it's that our bodies are a way that God reveals himself to us. It's a fascinating idea. And then finally, I'm only about halfway through this book, so I won't recommend it just yet. Okay. But that's a good start on the goodness of the human body. There's a lot to talk about right there, especially when it comes to the issue of transgenderism and how do we deal with that as parents, how do we deal with that as communities and church members, and so on. Okay, how are we doing? 15 more minutes. Are you guys okay? Okay. Third, catastrophic loss. Number one, catastrophic loss of truth. Number two, catastrophic loss of identity. Number three, catastrophic loss of love. Catastrophic loss of love. That's that outward relationship. Jesus said that the greatest commandment was to what? It's interesting. The greatest commandment is not to obey. It's not to think. It's not even to believe. The greatest commandment is to love. And the second one is like unto it, and that is love your Neighbor as yourself. There's a number of things we can talk about in terms of the loss of love. The first thing that I'll talk about is the meaning of words. C.S. Lewis said, for every new book, read 3 old ones. I'm always like, for every new one, read 3 C.S. Lewis books. And you'll be in good shape. And one of the books that we need for this generation right now is the book, The Four Loves. Because when you look at the book, The Four Loves, what you'll realize is the vast majority of the time the word love is thrown around in our culture, it's not referring to love at all. It's not referring to any of the 4 that Lewis identifies. Usually, love in our culture refers to a sentimentality or some sort of disordered sexuality. And none of those are a legitimate understanding of love. Chesterton said, if words aren't worth fighting for, what on earth would be? And one of the words we've got to learn to fight for is the word love. There's a question. This is a real practical strategy you can keep in your back pocket. It's super helpful. It also helps with the catastrophic loss of truth. It is a discernment question, but it's a question, what do you mean by that? So when someone comes up to you and uses words like freedom or male or truth or love, a great follow-up question is, well, what do you mean by that? You better believe it. My 3 daughters come up to me and say, Dad, I love that boy. My first question is going to be, what do you mean by love? And then it's, what do you mean by boy, and where is he? You know, that's how it works. That's the order of things. I got a plan. It's all planned out. The other thing, though, that has led, I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but we do understand that things get normalized in culture not just because of the ideas. Cultural shifts are made up of ideas, but ideas alone aren't enough to change culture. One of the things that's required to change culture are artifacts, real tangible things that enter culture and make things that are unthinkable thinkable. An example is the Protestant Reformation. In the Protestant Reformation, the ideas included, for example, the priesthood of all believers. That wasn't a believable idea. That wasn't a sticky idea in a culture where the church was literate, the larger population was not, and the texts were in Latin and not in the common language. So you needed an artifact. You needed something to be, an invention can be an artifact in that case. It was the greatest invention in the history of the world. It put Bibles into every single person's, or into most people's hands, right? Many people point back and say it is the greatest invention in the history of Western civilization. What is that? The iPad, right? Yeah. No, it was the printing press, right? And that made that idea thinkable, okay? One of the artifacts that has led to the loss of love, culturally speaking, is glowing rectangles that are everywhere. I'm going to point you to someone who has thought about this. I've just been really struck by Sherry Turkle. Sherry Turkle is a psychologist at MIT. She's been writing on technology, the internet, for 30 years. I first came across her books in seminary. She first wrote about the impact that computers were having on us in the 1980s. Do you remember what computers were in the 1980s? They were ginormous calculators, right? I mean, this is before Al Gore gave us the internet, right? This is early. And basically, computers were a place where we went and figured out problems. Well, Sherry Turkle is a psychologist, and she talks about this in one of her TED Talks. And she's like, at this point, we would meet and we would try to figure out what's the future of this, where should this go? And she said, essentially what we were trying to do is figure out how to keep our computers busy. And now, of course, our computers do what? They keep us busy. In the 1980s, she wrote this book and she made a prediction. She made a prediction that the computer would not just be a place where people went and did calculations, that it would become increasingly a place where people would live. She predicted that in the 1980s. In the 1990s, this is after the internet, but before social media, kind of in the age of chat rooms, she wrote a second book. And in that book, after watching how humans behaved with their machines, she predicted that the computer would not just be a place where we go live, it would be a place where we go explore alternative identities. I remember reading this in seminary, and it's like she's a postmodernist. She didn't think there was an essential aspect to who we are as human beings. We can be whoever we want to be. And so I remember reading this one sentence in there, it was just stunning, where she was like, isn't it great that a lonely, isolated 65-year-old man can go on the internet and be someone else, like a 17-year-old girl, if he wants to be. And she wrote it as if it were a good thing. She didn't write her third book until 2011. And I came across that book, and I read the foreword of it, and I was like, oh, something has changed. So I asked her to be on my podcast. And I said, you've changed. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you used to be so optimistic about what computers were going to do for us. But it seems like that optimism is gone. And she said, oh, absolutely. She said, John, I wasn't prescient. I didn't understand the bad things that were going to come along with kind of the invasion of technology in all of our lives. I said, well, what happened? She said, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I have a teenage daughter now. In her third book, and the third book is such a great title, it's called Alone Together. And Alone Together, she basically argues that humans were quickly reaching the point where we're going to have to make the very hard choices between real relationships and virtual or mediated relationships. And it's not just between mediated relationships, it's actually virtual relationships. I don't know if you've noticed, for example, how many conversations you actually are forced to have with a computer on a daily basis. I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago on Saturday Night Live, John Mulvaney began with his monologue, and he said, we spend a lot of time proving to computers, or proving to robots that we're not robots. Isn't it true? He's like, are you a robot? You're talking to a robot while you're proving that. In her book, Turkle talks about how the integration of artificial intelligence and robotic technology and the tragic, catastrophic loss of our relational existence is going to basically make possible the demand. It's going to drive the demand for artificial companions, and that they'll be more attractive to us than other people. That's her prediction in this one. She got the first two dead on. That's her prediction in the third one. I mean, can you imagine coming home from work and there's someone there that looks exactly like you want them to, gives you the the visual feedback, the empathy that you need, and says, hey, honey, how was your day? And as you pour out your heart to them, there's a facial, there's this kind of response that they have. And then when you're done, you never have to hear about their day. Now, this is where I always stop and go, does that sound crazy? Yes. Does this sound possible? Isn't that interesting? Now, the amazing thing here is the antidote to this is the first and great commandment. I used to live in Tennessee. There was an old guy in my church who would say, whenever anybody would say something obvious, he'd be like, hey, man, it ain't rocket surgery. And this falls into the it ain't rocket surgery category. Okay? And that is, in an age where there is such a catastrophic loss of love and relationship, Christians obeying the first and second commandment have an amazing, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Relationships. Very practically, Sherry Turkle, by the way, says that on a very practical level in your home, you should have 4 sacred spaces. This is her word. She's not a believer as far as I know. Sacred spaces. 4 places where you have no technology. Ready? Number 1 is in the car, because you have a captive audience for a conversation. Now, I have a 5-year-old. When we do a long road trip, I break that commandment, okay, just for the record. But in driving around, no technology, you have a captive audience. Number 2, the dinner table. The dinner table. The number 1 predictor of a child's long-term success is that they live in a home with married mom and dad. The number 2 predictor of a child's long-term success is they have meals together. And now, of course, dinner tables are interrupted by a million, everyone has their own glowing rectangle right with them. So she's like, dinner table, sacred space. Number 3, the bedroom. Now, there's two ways to talk about this. Number one is, it is insane. And by insane, I mean foolish and crazy and nuts. And what on earth could we possibly be thinking to allow our kids to have unfettered, unregulated access to the internet in the privacy of their own bedrooms? That is the definition of folly, as Proverbs puts it. And I'm not being harsh. I'm just saying it's insane. And you're just like, well, my kid's not looking for that stuff. That stuff's looking for your kid. Oh, and your kid probably is too, because he's a sinner like the rest of us. It's just, I remember I used to try to like talk about this. I'd be like, it's like putting your kid in a lion's den. And this mom came up to me, this mom of a teenage boy came up to me. She goes, stop saying that, that's stupid. I was like, well, thanks, what would you prefer? She's like, what you need to say is, giving your kid the internet is like putting a teenage boy in a room all night with a naked woman. I was like, yeah, it's a much better analogy, actually. Thank you, I will change. Because it's true. I mean, it's just that great. You know what Turkle also says, though, is that the bedroom should be a tech-free zone for adults. She's like, how much intimacy is lost? The kids are in bed. How much physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, conversational, relational intimacy, because that technology invades that sacred space. And the fourth one that she says is just something scheduled. So a room. Every time you're in this room, no phones. Every time, this day of the week, of course, that's a rhythm that Scripture gives us in the Sabbath. That's something that we try to do at our home. We don't always succeed. But it is just having a day or having something in a rhythm where you break that technology. Does that make sense? Very, very helpful stuff, and it creates this space for relational capital to flourish. All right, last catastrophic loss, and I got 2 minutes to do this one, so I'll do it really fast. The last catastrophic loss is the catastrophic loss of meaning. 10 years ago, a study was done of British young people, and they asked the question, does life have meaning? It was not a specific, does life have meaning in God or meaning in sports or meaning in politics? It was just, does life have meaning? So they could choose whatever they want to say life have meaning. 9 out of 10 of these young people said yes. 10 years later, that number was just over 1 out of 10 that said yes. Midway through 2020, I saw there in the midway through 2020, I saw the number that I was dreading, and I couldn't believe it was actually true. It was actually the fall of 2020, where the CDC reported that in the early months of the pandemic, 1 out of 4 school-age students in America had some level of suicidal ideation during the pandemic. I saw that and couldn't even believe that could possibly be true. Now the numbers are coming in, and when it talks about addiction and when it talks about that sort of stuff. A few weeks ago, I was speaking to the board of a Christian college, very good Christian college, and the department heads were there too, and I spoke, and then we had some interaction. And the head of the Department of Counseling, and they both have a master's in undergrad in counseling, master's in counseling that they provide. They provide counseling services to the students and counseling services to the wider community out of this Christian college. And the guy asked a question, I can't remember what the question is, but in the process of asking the question, he used a phrase called treatment-resistant depression. And I was like, wait a minute, I've never heard that phrase before. That sounds new. He goes, it is new. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, first of all, it refers to the fact that more of our students are reporting, this is students at this Christian, more of the students are reporting depression than before. And the typical coping mechanisms, the strategies that we would give them to cope with depression, they're not working. That's what we mean, treatment-resistant depression. I said, so what are you doing? He said, honestly, we're going back to Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl survived Nazi occupation and a concentration camp and wrote a book coming out of it called A Man's Search for Meaning. And his argument was the difference between those who were able to survive and those that weren't, if they weren't just killed, is the fact that those who actually had a source and a grounding for meaning. It's what Nietzsche said. Nietzsche said, if you have a why, you can live with any what. Understand that the untethering from a fixed reference point untethers you from the one who endows the world with purpose. Does that make sense? And what the result, this is the parable of the madman that has gone from being, a prophecy for him and an argument in the middle of the 20th century to being an existential reality. We have a whole lot of whats. We have more whats than any time in human history. We have more things to play with, more things to buy, more things to take our time. What we don't have on a cultural level is a why. And that's, I think, an antidote for us. Ready? An antidote for us. And it's got to be explicit and it's got to be intentional for how we spend our time, what classes we sign them up for, what we ask them to do, what we ask them to read, what we allow them to buy. Here it is. No what's without a why. Give a why to every what. Give a why to every what. I'm going to come back after the break and put hopefully some flesh around that, or in the next keynote. And if it comes up in the Q&A, we'll do that too. All right. But I'm out of time. And she's looking like you're out of time. Didn't she look like that? Didn't you think so? I thought so too. All right, thanks.